It's the early 1800s, and the United States is a young nation, grappling with law and order as its cities begin to grow. Prisons at this time are mostly makeshift, often just a part of the local sheriff's home where debtors and petty thieves are held. But as the century progresses, so does the idea of incarceration. The 1820s saw the birth of the penitentiary, a revolutionary idea out of Philadelphia. The concept? To reform the soul, not just punish the body. The Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors in 1829 with a structure that resembles a wheel, with spokes leading to individual cells. Each prisoner is isolated, left alone with their thoughts and a Bible. The idea being to encourage penitence, hence the term penitentiary. As America marched through the 19th and 20th century, the number of penitentiaries balloons. The Civil War and the turbulent Reconstruction era brought waves of new offenses, many which were politically motivated. These filled these burgeoning institutions, but it's not just about handling these criminals, but it's about controlling certain populations. Post-war law disproportionately targeted freed slaves and their descendants, a precursor to the racial disparities that we see in the system today. Prisons became a tool not just for public safety, but for social control. By the 1980s, with prisons overflowing due to the war on drugs, as discussed in a previous video, the government faced a dilemma. Building and maintaining prisons was pretty expensive. Enter the private sector, promising a cheaper and more efficient form of management. The first private prison opened in 1984, igniting a controversial industry that claims to save taxpayer dollars while drawing criticism for profiteering on human captivity. Critics argue that with profit motives comes a push for higher incarceration rates and longer sentences. But as the Industrial Revolution takes hold, so did the gears of change for the prison system. What began as a moral quest quickly turned into an opportunity for profit. By the time we hit the late 20th century, prisons were no longer just facilities for reform, they were a big business. So let's dive into how this shift happens and what it means for millions of Americans today. My name is Mark, and welcome to my channel. I make deep dives into the dark side of money, power, and business, empowering you, my cherished viewer, with all the tools you need to take control of your future. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe, as doing so helps push my content through the YouTube algorithm. Now tap in, and I'll explain.
There was a belief that you could put a prisoner in his own solitary cell, freed from the evil influences of modern society. And if you put them in that cell, they would become like a penitent monk, free to come close to God and to their own inner being, and they would naturally heal from the evils of the outside society.
Let's rewind the tape back to the 1800s. Back then, prisons were a part of a public penance system that focused more on moral reform than mere punishment. Inmates were isolated and were left to reflect on their crimes in hopes of spiritual rehabilitation. But as the 20th century unfolded, the philosophies governing the prison system began to shift as well. It shifted dramatically. By the mid-1900s, the United States was navigating complex social and political currents. The civil rights movements, as well as cultural revolutions and an increasing drug problem, brought new challenges to law enforcement and the justice system. It wasn't until the 1970s, however, under President Nixon, that the term war on drugs was officially coined, signifying a profound shift in national crime policy. Nixon's administration marked the beginning of a series of federal campaigns which aimed at eradicating illegal drug use and distribution. But it was during the Reagan administration in the 1980s that these policies intensified. President Reagan expanded the war on drugs with tougher policies and penalties. Mandatory sentencing, especially for drug offenses, became the norm. These laws required judges to impose fixed sentences on individuals convicted of certain crimes, predominantly drug-related offenses. The Anti-Drug and Abuse Act of 1986, for example, enacted a mandatory minimum sentences and dramatically increased the number of arrests and convictions. This legislative environment contributed to a massive spike in incarceration rates. The U.S. prison population soared from about 500,000 in 1980 to over 1.5 million by the late 90s. Prisons, once institutions aimed at reform and rehabilitation, were rapidly turning into overcrowded facilities primarily focused on confinement. The explosive growth not only strained the capacity of existing facilities, but also spurred the rise of private prisons as a solution to handle the overflow.
On any given day in the United States, around 2 million people are being held in federal, state, local, juvenile, immigration, and other detention centers. But when you look at who comes under correctional control over a whole year, that number is closer to 10 million people.
Fast forward to today, and the prison industry has indeed become just that, an industry. The concept of privatizing incarceration began to gain traction as a solution to the surging prison populations, which were caused by strict drug sentencing laws and the war on drugs in the 80s. In 1983, Corrections Corporation of America, now known as CoreCivic, opened the first private prison in the United States. This marked the beginning of a new era where incarceration was seen not just as a governmental responsibility, but also big business and an opportunity for wealth. You see, the appeal of private prisons to government officials was primarily financial. Advocates claimed that private companies could build and manage these prisons more efficiently than the public sector, potentially saving millions of dollars in taxpayer funds. This promise of cost reduction was compelling at a time when states were, let's say, overwhelmed by exploited incarceration rates and the associated costs. However, by 2019, the number of private facilities has grown significantly. There were 121 private prisons in the US, housing over 7% state prisoners and 16% federal ones. This growth was not just in numbers, but in the scope of services provided. Private firms began to offer a full range of services, from facility design to construction to daily management and logistical support. However, the financial benefits of privatization have been hotly debated. Studies and reports have provided mixed results regarding cost savings, with some finding minimal differences in operational costs between the public and private facilities. Moreover, concerns have risen about the quality of care and oversight in private prisons. Critics argue that the profit motive can lead to cost-cutting measures that, of course, compromise the safety, security, and prisoner welfare. Instances of understaffing, inadequate medical care, and neglect are some of the issues that have surfaced over the years. Moreover, the business model of private prisons depends fundamentally on maintaining high levels of incarceration, perceived by critics as a perverse incentive.
The private prison model was simple: build and manage buildings and secure government contracts. Charge a daily fee for each bed you fill, something called per diem, or what is commonly referred to as mandates.
Contracts between private prison companies and governments often include what are called occupancy guarantees. This promises payment for a certain percentage of prison capacity, which can create governmental obligations to keep prison beds filled, rather than focusing on reducing crime or even rehabilitating the offenders. Speaking of economics, let's delve deeper into the realm of labor within the prison system. Prison labor, a practice steeped in controversy, is indeed a billion-dollar industry. Across the United States, inmates are employed in a variety of industries, often receiving pay that ranges from mere cents to $1 per hour, far below the wage in any state. This isn't a fringe activity. It's a major economic operation involving some of the largest private and public sector enterprises. The range of work done by prisoners has expanded significantly beyond traditional tasks like making license plates or simple road work. Today, inmates might be found working in a call center, assembling furniture, or even sewing uniforms. Companies in these sectors such as telecommunications, manufacturing, and agriculture contract prison labor to cut down on labor costs, leveraging the low wages that prisons can legally pay their inmates. This practice is legally sanctioned by an exception in the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. The use of prison labor has been justified on several grounds. It's argued to provide inmates with work experience and skills that can aid their reintegration back into society upon release. However, the reality is often less than ideal. Many inmates work in conditions that have little relation to their sentences or rehabilitation needs, and the skills acquired are not always transferable to the outside world. Moreover, the pay they receive is often insufficient to meet their basic needs in prison or to support their families on the outside, let alone save for the future. Furthermore, this economic model raises significant ethical concerns. The reliance on cheap prison labor can only be seen as a modern form of exploitation, with companies benefiting from near free labor while the inmates work under conditions that few others in society would accept. This dynamic can perpetuate a cycle where prisons are seen not just as institutions of public safety or rehabilitation, but as a source of cheap labor, incentivizing higher rates of incarceration. Critics also point out that the profit motive can lead to dependency on incarceration for economic reasons, influencing public policy and prison management practices in ways that prioritize financial benefits over rehabilitation and justice. This intertwining of economic interests and correctional policy poses profound questions about the fairness and the purpose of the American penal system. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: racial disparities. These disparities are stark and deeply concerning. While Black Americans make up only about 13% of the US population, they constitute about 40% of the incarcerated population. This disproportionate representation isn't just a series of isolated incidents, but a pervasive pattern that points to broader systemic issues within the criminal justice system. The roots of these disparities are multifaceted and historically entrenched. Alleged racial profiling is a significant factor. Studies and reports consistently show that Black individuals are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested by law enforcement compared to their white counterparts. For instance, traffic stop studies across the United States have repeatedly demonstrated that Black drivers are stopped more frequently than white drivers, often without the same levels of justifiable cause. As well, once arrested, they journey through the justice system, which is continued to be fraught with inequality. Sentencing disparities are another critical element contributing to racial imbalance in prisons. For similar crimes, Black defendants are frequently handed harsher sentences than white defendants. The disparities are particularly noticeable in the case of drug-related offenses, where mandatory minimum sentencing laws have historically had a disproportionately negative impact on Black communities. This is despite evidence showing similar rates of drug use and sales amongst Black and white populations.
The programs of the drug war continued targeting low-income communities of color with more police, more surveillance, and eventually more incarceration under much harsher sentences.
Moreover, the impact of these disparities extends beyond the individual to affect whole communities. The high incarceration rates among Black Americans contribute to broader social and economic challenges, including disrupted family structures, decreased employment opportunities, and increased poverty. The cycle of incarceration can become a self-perpetuating loop, where each generation faces similar challenges, perpetuated not only by policing and sentencing practices, but also by broader social and economic barriers. The consequences are not limited to the individuals and their communities, but they also pose a moral challenge to the society that upholds these systems. The continuing existence of such disparities raises profound questions about the principles and equality and justice proportionally foundational to the American legal system. So, how does the US stack up globally? With about 655 inmates per 100,000 people, the US not only leads the world in incarceration rates, but also sets a record that far surpasses other heavy incarcerators like Russia, China, and Iran. This statistic is more than just a number. It reflects a deep-seated approach to crime and punishment that differs markedly from much of the rest of the world. To put these numbers into perspective, let's look at some comparisons. Russia, often cited for its tough law enforcement policies, has an incarceration rate of about 413 per 100,000. China, with a more opaque system, reports significantly lower rates, though actual numbers might be unreported due to its closed judicial system in the CCP. Meanwhile, Iran, known for its strict legal codes, has a rate of around 287 per 100,000. In stark contrast, Scandinavian countries such as Norway, Sweden, and Finland emphasize rehabilitation over retribution. For instance, Norway boasts one of the lowest incarceration rates in the world, around 75 per 100,000 people. The focus in these nations is not just about detaining offenders, but on preparing them to reintegrate into society as productive members. Prisons in these countries often resemble comfortable dormitories rather than the barred cells typically found in the US, and feature various programs aimed at education, mental health, and vocational training.
The basic question that we ask ourselves in Norway: what kind of neighbor do we really want? Because they could move into my neighborhood and they could move into your neighborhood. So I think this is an important question to ask ourselves, really.
The philosophy underpinning the Scandinavian model is fundamentally different. The emphasis is on restorative justice, which seeks to repair the harm caused by the criminal behavior. This is done through reconciliation with victims and the community at large. This approach not only humanizes those who commit the crimes, but also integrates them back into society, reducing the rates of reincarceration, the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. Moreover, the comparison reveals broader societal impacts. High incarceration rates in the US are correlated with significant public expenditure, societal stratification, and long-term economic impacts, both the individuals who serve time and for the communities. In contrast, countries with lower incarceration rates and a focus on rehabilitation often report lower crime rates and higher levels of general social trust and cohesion. This global perspective invites a critical reflection on the effectiveness and the morality of differing justice systems. It raises important questions about the goals of such systems. Is the purpose of incarceration to punish, to deter, to rehabilitate, or to protect the public? And crucially, which of these goals are we effectively meeting? Even in the 21st century, some US prisons still employ methods that hark back to much darker times. Among these, solitary confinement stands out as particularly controversial due to its severe psychological impacts and its widespread use as a method of control. This practice involves isolating inmates in small cells, usually about 6 by 9, for 22 to 24 hours a day, with minimal human contact or environmental stimulation. Often it's used for disciplinary purposes, for the protection of the inmate, or as a management tool for these who are deemed difficult to control. The psychological effects of such isolation can be profound. Research shows that extended periods in solitary confinement can lead to a range of mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and hallucinations. Some inmates experience irreversible psychological trauma and may struggle to reintegrate into society upon release. The lack of social interaction and sensory deprivation often result in what psychologists call social death, which can exacerbate pre-existing mental conditions and lead to new ones. International bodies, including the United Nations, have raised serious concerns about this practice. The UN's Mandela Rules, which set international standards for the treatment of prisoners, specify that keeping someone in solitary for more than 15 consecutive days constitutes torture. Yet in the US, it's not uncommon for inmates to be held in solitary for months or even years. Criticism of solitary confinement isn't just about its moral and psychological implications. There's also a debate about its effectiveness. Supporters claim it's necessary to maintain order and safety within prisons, arguing that it's a critical tool for handling inmates who are violent or disruptive. However, opponents counter that it is usually too broadly and often used as a first rather than a last resort. Studies suggest that rather than reducing violence, this prolonged solitary confinement may actually increase the risk of future violent behavior. In light of these concerns, there is growing advocacy within the US to reform or abolish the practice of solitary confinement. These states have begun to implement restrictions on its use, especially for juveniles and individuals with mental illness, reflecting a shift towards more humane treatment standards. However, the road to substantial change is long, and the debate continues to evoke strong feelings about the balance between safety, punishment, and rehabilitation in the American penal system. Despite these challenges, the call for reform is louder than ever. Public awareness of these issues has grown, thanks in part to documentaries, books, and advocacy by high-profile activists and organizations. This increased visibility has pressured lawmakers and politicians to take a closer look at the penal system and consider more humane and effective approaches to justice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the modern prison system in the US, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. These videos take quite some time to edit, produce, and make. Your support is greatly appreciated. And as always, I've been Mark, you've been great. Stay dangerous, and I'll see you in the next one.